So a facilitator, in my view, is the one who kind of makes it easy for people to do something. Of course, facilitation does not only happen in the room. Hi, I'm Charles de Maere, and you're listening to GGUTtalks. GGUTT.
Hi, I'm Maria and welcome to GGUTT Talks, where we co-create a collective intelligence involving both people who are not always in the limelight and those who are, in order to learn from each other and spread knowledge, creative and critical thinking in the business world. All I ask is to follow or subscribe to the show and get in touch. It helps me know that there are actually people listening and I'm actually not just shouting into the void. Now let's get started. Charles de Maere transitioned from being a technical lead, scrum master and agile coach to facilitator, empowered by his experience in machine-to-machine communication and human-to-human communication loopholes. He's the founder of Exploration Labs, where he helps teams work better together. We talk about facilitation, understanding culture and being a process expert versus a field or industry expert. Here we go. We met a few years ago during a test session about clean language and coaching. And back then I was invited by Judy Reese, who was on the show. And there were some group activities and that's where we met, kind of stayed in touch online. So we're going to be discussing facilitation, visual facilitation and your experience. And you're also a coach. And you started off having a technical background, some sort of nerdy stuff. You told me last time you were doing. And then you transitioned into what you do today. So my question is, what's your, if you want, single product building lesson?
Okay, just to be sure that, thanks for the question, but to be sure that I understand when you talk about product building, because there's many ways to understand that. We can talk about building products in the software world, or we can also building product like building a brand and stuff like that. So which one is it?
It's the software world just because of your background. So I'm just intrigued, but what was it that you learned there? I just want to understand how you then transitioned.
Yeah, good point. So for my technical background, I'm going to keep it to the point. I basically started off in the systems administrator world, which is really like the nerdy stuff where we get to dive into databases. We write some scripts to ensure that the things keep turning on the different operating centers. And basically we were also called at night when the little green lights became either amber or red. This is like the stuff you sometimes see in movies, although it's probably not as sexy as what we see in movies, but anyway. And then from that part, at some point I moved into the software development team. So basically I built the software that was running on these servers. And there was also changing the lights from green to amber to red, depending on the status. And this is where I realized that the product people, so like the people who were in contact with the clients, were always asking us to build stuff that was supposed to do this and this and that. And hardly ever actually we got the requests from the people who run the servers, my former colleagues. And I'm like, when we're building a product, actually, what's the point of building it only for the client if it's hard to maintain? So realizing that actually we need to align much more people than just a client was maybe one of the biggest lessons that I had. And this is where I also realized that technically, getting systems to talk to one another is easy once you know the rules. Getting human beings to talk to one another and to align and to work together, even though you know the rules, will always bring in some surprises. So
yeah. Well, so do you have a story to share on that one? Like sort of an aha moment where you're like, damn, people can't talk to each other?
Yeah, so the story was, I would say maybe some 12 years ago. So we're recording this in 2024. If people listen to this in 10 years in the future, it's always good to, So 10 to 12 years ago, I was working for a financial company in Belgium that is dealing for the technically, so, when you go to a shop, you put your bank card in a terminal or on a terminal. Now we can tap them and so on, and we can tap our phones and so on. So basically, we were dealing with all the software that happens behind those terminals. So when you put your card in order to pay, well, first it checks your balance and then it checks also where to put the money. It's always nice to put the money on the right account than to a random shop. So that's basically how the system worked. And we had this wonderful mainframe system that we were migrating to some more modern system at a time, some Linux and Oracle databases and so on. But that, of course, meant that we had to upgrade the systems. And back in 2012, it was a project which was actually also the first offshore project of that organization. So we were working with developers from Pune and Mumbai, fantastic people. And the thing is, at the beginning, they told us, just send us the technical documentation and we'll develop, because we're developers, right? So we just need to read it and it will work. The reality of that is that, of course, when you have a system that's as complex as managing what happens behind the payment terminals, it's important to have a kind of a business understanding of what's happening. And the technical documentation, if you don't have any real world counterpart, it can get hard to get into the work. And after a couple of months, we realized that, yes, they were reading the documentation, but developing the systems was kind of hard. And maybe my aha moment was that we had never told them actually, like how it works behind the payment terminals, because actually while talking to the team, I realized that in Mumbai and Pune at that time, cash was still a highly, the main way of payment, and card payment was pretty rare. Whereas in Belgium, we've been using card payments for more than, I think ever since I can remember. I remember that we had bank cards, and so that's the thing. So understanding, for instance, when you go to a shop and then you have to pay, technically, they scan all the articles and at the end you put your card and then you pay. But for instance, when you refuel your car, it works a little differently, because first you pay your card and then you put your card back in the pocket and then you can refuel your car, and it will stop either when you don't have any money left on your bank account or when it has reached the amount. And then at the end, technically, it will send the official payment message. So this is the difference. When you go to a shop, you get the payment message as soon as you have the final amount. But when you refuel your car, you first need to tap the card and then you can refuel, and the final amount is only sent later. So there's different messages that are being sent. I can explain it in a couple of words here, but in the technical documentation, of course, it was like we have all these different types of messages, but the whole background was not that clear. So my aha moment was really like, as soon as we started talking about this, like I just did, well, it all started to make more sense. That was one thing. The other thing is also, like, me as a Belgian working for the first time with people from Mumbai and Pune, I hadn't realized how much respect is a value there. And this is one thing where, in order to kind of, because they respect their elders much more than we do in Belgium, or because there's also a lot of respect with the client. We were the client. So if I was to say something they didn't understand, well, so we didn't have video calls at that time, but I'm sure I would have seen a head nod when, like the famous Indian head nod that actually means like I say yes because I can't say no and I don't want to put you into an uncomfortable position. So this is also a learning, like when people say yes, it doesn't mean that they understand what you say. It sometimes means something else. So it's about how do we fish for that information without making the other look bad. Or these are a couple of the highlights. And actually, I learned a lot there on how to work with others, and that technically not everyone thinks like a Belgian. Like, hey, surprise, surprise.
That's interesting. I want to wrap something into this, because obviously you dealt with all those terms and methodologies and, agile and scrum and blah, blah, blah. So this alone, if there's no proper communication and understanding the culture and understanding how people think in different places, doesn't mean anything, right?
Yeah.
So what is it that led you? Maybe you want to say something on this. I have a feeling you said yes. So another story here.
So maybe something more even in the context, because the context there was like the people in Belgium were sure that their colleagues from Mumbai and Pune would take their jobs away. And so this is even more a difficult context where it's like, okay, but we have to work together, folks, the decision to work together with people from India has been made on a level that, like, it's not like we can control this, or it's not like we can influence this. So it's about making the best of these worlds where, in a way, we had our colleagues from, I can't say overseas when I talk between Europe and India because there's no real sea between, but we had our colleagues from India and that were eager to learn and to work on these systems. And there was a kind of protectionism from some of the Belgian colleagues who were really afraid that they would get their jobs, that they would get sacked because all the work would be done in India. But what we actually realized is that we needed each other really to work together. And so this is, as you say, it's about understanding that people work and think differently and embracing this as a fact rather than a difficulty that we'll never be able to solve. And this is what really made me curious about, like, how can we, with the Belgians who can just say stuff bluntly to one another, even to their manager or their manager's managers, and we work with people who are highly respectful of the management line or their client, how can we work together? I remember sometimes also I asked some of my colleagues from India to, hey, can you do this and this and that? And then technically they spoke with their manager, who then spoke to their manager, who spoke to their counterpart in Belgium. I mean, it came back to me and, like, how dare you tell the other one what to do? But it was like, okay, at some point it was like, okay, but how can we still work together? Because we need to be able to align on who does what. And maybe it was, so I also realized that I had maybe overstepped my bounds, or I had to adapt my way of communicating or working in order to also acknowledge and accommodate this other way of viewing hierarchy.
That's a good point. And what you're saying what you're saying now is like the conversation that's happening today with AI, right? You're going to be sacked because of AI in a way. But it's all about finding other ways to augment capabilities. Also, I'm not saying this will happen or not, but it's kind of the same conversation, just with a different type of stakeholder in that sense. So you mentioned a few things. Maybe let's touch on one thing here. Let's assume this question has kind of two parts, right? Right now, you're a facilitator. Maybe you can expand on what facilitation is from your perspective, because you also talk about invisible facilitation. And there's the other part of coaching into that other component. So how do you balance this out also in what you do? So answer this the way you want, really. You want to start with coaching and then facilitation. What did you do? I'm more interested about your journey and how your brain worked to get you to where you are today.
All right. So I think that the main story of what brought me where I am today is I always think like, oh, when I do this job, I'll finally understand everything there is to understand of how people work together. So you talked earlier on about Agile and Scrum. And yes, when I worked at that financial company, we also started experimenting a little bit with Scrum. But it's only in my next contract that I really experimented with what it's like to be a Scrum Master. And I realized that it's really about like organizational transformation. It's not only about teamwork. And our friend Tobias Maere just sent out a newsletter the other day also where he talks about that. But Scrum Mastering is not just, facilitating the meetings, but the way that we can work with Scrum can put the basis of a real transformation in the way we work with stakeholders. Because I was working at that point with the team, worked for a government team in Belgium, and we never could have our stakeholder on board in the sprint review. So for those who don't know Scrum, you don't need to know anything about Scrum, but what I'll say is technically we work on something and very regularly we show what we've worked on in order to get feedback from it. So the sprint review is one of those moments where we try to get feedback, and having the client in the room at that point is super important so that they can also share the feedback on what we've developed. And we could not get the person who was technically paying for the product. And at some point we realized that technically we were developing something and then we sent it to some folks who would use it, like power users who would use it. And then afterwards we would like deliver it. And then we thought, well, it's a bit, maybe these people we could invite in order to get some feedback. And the person who was using the systems the most was really the one who was actually an assistant. So in a government agency, it was seen like somebody of like really lower rank, if I may say so. So inviting her was like, yeah, but why would we invite her? She's like, But then we did invite her, and in the first few reviews, she really started to give some harsh feedback on stuff that had been developed. Hey, you're doing this, well, great. But if I need to do this, I see that I need to do 15 clicks. And this is something that I do 30 times a day, so it's too much. Find a way to make it easier for me. And so the developers at the beginning were a bit taken aback. But after a couple of sessions, there started to be a real like cooperation there. And also that person felt valued because her feedback was taken into account. And she was not seen as the one who shouts all the time, but she was actually one of the main users of our system. So she was the one who could give us precious feedback. And an anecdote is that at some point also, I think when it was her birthday, she would always celebrate it with our team more than with her team because we had so nice moments together. And so these are the kind of stories that show how cooperation really, really works. So that's one part of like my journey, because your question, I haven't started answering it yet. So bit by bit, I really realized that the facilitation aspect is really about putting people together, even putting the right people together at the right time so that they can work on stuff and self-align. And technically, the only thing I did was invite her. All the rest was done with the team. So maybe this is also invisible facilitation, like I didn't have to do much, just nudge a little bit, and then things change for themselves. There's also shows in how much the whole point of Scrum is really organizational transformation, because it's changed the relationships between a development team that was technically from an external company working with people from the government and the ones using the systems. Whereas maybe initially we would have invited the one giving the money for the project. But here it's more about the users who can give feedback.
Hey everyone, quick ask. If this is inspiring you to use creativity, critical thinking, or Gen AI for growth and the future of work, then let me know by tagging me or sending me a DM. And I'll definitely respond either way, so please do that. It helps me know that there are actually people listening and I'm not just shouting into the void. Now let's get going.
Yeah, it would be a bit more challenging, I think, to have the exact scenario now. Again, it depends on, which company it is, because you would have developers, you would have designers in the room also, and not only developers. So this human-centric aspect somehow would be there from the beginning. So you said you had a couple of reviews. That's 2 weeks. Right now, the dynamics would be a bit different, but it's a nice story, because you should always test with the real, those who will actually use the product or the service.
The ones who have skin in the game, basically.
Yep.
The ones who will suffer from needing to do 15 clicks 50 times a day.
Yeah, 15 clicks to solve it with another 15 clicks. But that's still common, actually. I was talking to a startup founder a few weeks ago, and he developed a solution and was wondering why no one was using it. It's because it was for chartered planes. And he was solving a problem or a challenge that pilots had because they had to do many things. But then the manual process of inputting the information on the calendar was like, I'm putting my right arm by my left ear, right? Did not make any sense. So you spoke about the facilitation aspect. What about the coaching?
So the coaching aspect, so we talked about this the other day as well. There's many ways of coaching. There's many definitions of coaching. I have done a coaching. I've been on a 1-year coaching learning track a couple of years ago. And in a way, I'm a bit cautious about using the word coaching today, even though sometimes people talk about agile coaching, and then there's life coaching, and there's executive coaching, and so on. Yeah. And I've seen around me sometimes the thing I find difficult with coaching is that I sometimes don't know where it begins to become therapy. And this is something I'm afraid of, because I haven't studied any psychological, I don't have any proper psychological background. So entering into therapy is a dangerous zone. And I know that in the coaching track that I followed, people said you need to be careful of not entering into therapy mode. But sometimes the person in front of you will say, I'm paying for coaching. Why should I go and do therapy on top of that? So it's a tricky relationship. So I'm more like, maybe, and like words and names and definitions. There's this Finnish, what's his name? Osmo Wio, who says communication usually fails except by accident. And I find it's a quite nice way. So maybe the work that I'm doing is less about coaching, but more about mentoring and like being there to give the answers that people need. Sometimes also one of the risks with coaching is like, like I'm going to give a question back so that people figure it out by themselves. And when the house is on fire, there's nothing that irritates people more than like, when they come to you and ask you whether they should go through the stairs or the elevator. And I'm like, what do you think? Like this is so it's really important to be able to know what you're doing and what you're there for, and also to make sure that the boundaries and that everyone's boundaries is respected. There's a thing maybe like consent. And if I'm working with groups and people don't consent to being coached, it's totally not okay to do that.
I mean, you kind of have the same challenge with facilitation also. I guess some wonder, why am I here? Why do I have to participate? Why are you here?
And this is really why a key thing about facilitation is the invitation. You get an invitation to participate in a workshop. You can come because you feel like you were forced to be there, but still taking the time in the beginning of the session to say, hey, why are you here? What made you come here? And to acknowledge that. And then you can say, Maria, you can say, well, I was here because my boss said so. And then, okay, but then we can at least acknowledge this and do something with it. What would you need for this still to be something successful? And the one thing also about the invitation is if an invitation cannot be refused, it's not an invitation.
Yeah, absolutely.
And putting this out there, I can still say, hey, if you feel like you couldn't say no, I mean, I'm fine if you leave the room.
Yes.
Oh, that you take your own ownership. And it's a way of putting some consent. Like, if you're still in the room, it means that you're going to help us solve whatever critical issue we have at hand.
Yeah, and this depends very much also on the culture and the trust kind of you're going to build very early on, because sometimes telling them you're welcome to leave, not like leave, FO, right? It's you're welcome to leave, or like you can leave or whatever. Again, how do they react to that one? It can be sensitive. And also dropping another thing here, but online also, right? You're not in the room. So how can this be perceived also?
Some people are present online, but they're not really present in the session.
Yeah.
So there are people who pretend they are there, but they're doing many other stuffs behind the scenes. And this is not, I would say that this is their own responsibility. It's not up to me to tell them by name, hey, Maria, what are you doing? It seems like you're not interested, or you don't have your camera on, like whatever. You could be doing other things because you had a call and your parents are in whatever difficult situation and you need to do something. Like these things happen. Of course, it's more difficult to witness this when you do something online than when you do something in person. But still, I really want to, as a facilitator, I think the key thing is to not do the work of others, which means if people are disengaged, it's their responsibility. Yes, we can try and do stuff. Maybe it's not the right people. Maybe they're not there for the right topic and so on. So what can we do? And it's not by singing a song together that it will solve everything. We need a workshop or strategic session, and so technically we're always there to kind of fix something or to find solutions to a specific thing. So when I'm an external facilitator, I have no skin in that game. What I can do is I can put all my energy and not all my energy, all my expertise into designing something that will help folks move along the way. But if we realize at the beginning that people are totally not engaged, well, then it's about, hey, what's happening in the room? Is this something we can talk about? and maybe we're not the right people, where maybe it's not the right subject, or maybe people feel like they've been dragged into a workshop where the outcome has already been defined.
Yeah, that's going into danger zone.
Exactly. So it's really about, but I think the key thing for facilitators is to make that obvious.
So going one step back, how do you explain what you do just for the audience? We had episodes where we discussed about facilitation and so on. Okay. But maybe not everyone listened to everything. So what's facilitation for you, for someone who maybe heard about it but is not so sure, but maybe focus also on invisible facilitation? I like the word around it, how you put it.
So when you look at maybe the French roots of facilitation, there is the word facile, which means easy. So a facilitator, in my view, is the one who kind of makes it easy for people to do something. I can be called for a strategic meeting where the organization needs to figure out how to organize the next 5 years, the famous 5-year plan. Or we have a crisis situation and we need to figure out how to deal with that quite rapidly because people are leaving our organization and we don't know what to do with that. So like all these things are, anything. But then it's all about for the things that I do is, of course, facilitation does not only happen in the room. I need to understand what the objective is. And for that, it's important to talk about the main stakeholder, the person who calls me like, hey, we have something, could you help us? I'm like, yeah, okay, what do you want to achieve? And then these people usually give me 15 to 20 goals. And I'm like, how much time do we have? Then it's 1 day. I'm like, okay, choose one, because...
So you're not the miracle man?
No. There are probably miracle men out there, but I'm more the boring, pragmatic person that doesn't sell dreams. Because I'd rather, if we only had half the time, or if people at some point, let's say there's lunchtime and then we get food poisoning and we cannot finish. What's the one goal that we, if we have it, that's a reasonable something. So when I frame it that way, then people are more like, yeah, okay, it makes sense. Sometimes we can have stuff. So I'd rather have one goal because then it helps to go towards that. And one of the strengths for me, a great facilitator is a person that is able to adapt on the flow. When something happens, okay, we have our objective, we have the right people in the room, we have the right topic and so on. And then after half an hour, after 1 hour, someone says something that totally derails everything. And it seems to be something very important because there's a silence and then nobody reacts. This is where the skilled facilitator will find a way to integrate this into the work. And that also means maybe changing the goal of the session. But that doesn't mean that I do this behind the scenes. I make it very obvious. I'm like, hey, okay, Maria, what you said there, can you tell me a bit more? And then check with the stakeholder. Hey, what do you make of that? Okay, great. So we were here for topic A. I hear now that there's topic B that seems something quite important. Of course, we can't do both. And then I put it back into the group. What would you like to do next? And a friend of mine who's into role-playing games once told me that actually facilitation is a bit like being the role player's game master. So for those who are familiar or unfamiliar with it, a role-playing game is basically telling a story with friends. Everybody plays a character, mostly in fantasy settings, but it can happen in other settings. And there's one person who kind of controls the whole environment, describes the setting they're entering in. If you enter a tavern, what does it look like? That person will also play the different characters that the players interact with. So they're making the world a living place. And a facilitator is perhaps also someone like that who's responsible for maintaining the space so that people inside of it can do something and have meaningful interactions.
You mentioned something important here. It's about setting the right expectations or the expectations, and then you can change them along the way with people's agreement or even decision, because you have this flexibility and you need to adapt, and this is essential. Otherwise, it's too rigid, then you won't get anywhere. Because sometimes you can assume, even after lots of research, that this is the objective, and that would not be the fault of anyone, but because sometimes you're not able, I guess, to talk to everybody to understand the status quo. And you come in with, I had this happen. I remember this story. I had this happen where I was told something like, no, they do not want this. This is not the goal. This is absolutely not what they need because they don't do that. We don't do this in the company. Like we don't, okay, fine. It's not even something I was suggesting, but they put it out there. Then I come in and it was absolutely the opposite. And this is all what they needed and all what they did, right? And on the spot, we need to figure it out, right?
This is exactly that. It's really about figuring out on the spot how to deal with surprises, because there will always be some, and people will tell you it's not about that. And then after the first 5 minutes, it's the only thing that people talk about. And so it's like, okay, what do we do? And there's like, sometimes it can also be like, do we still have the right people in the room? Because if that's the topic and not the one that we thought initially, do we need to adapt? So facilitation to me is really like, holding the space, ensuring that stuff happens while not doing the work of others. And this is probably where the invisible part comes in.
And let me just touch on why you're not doing the work of others, because one, it's not your job. And two, I mean, they are the experts.
Exactly.
Anyway.
Yeah. A couple of weeks ago, or 1 month ago, I was doing a 2-day retreat for a non-profit organization in Belgium that deals with yoga in healthcare. So they work with medical houses and they provide yoga support for people who need it. And we're coming together for a 2-day retreat where the first day was supposed to be sharing of best practices. Because in the yoga world, and I am totally not an expert in yoga, but I've learned this now. In the yoga world, there's people who are really into the, I would say, more philosophical and, dare I say, esoteric part of it. And some are more into the, using it as a kind of a way to get your body to move in different places. And when you go to medical houses, well, the more you go into esoteric things, the less likely you're going to get called again. So it's also important to kind of, hey, when we're working with these kinds of clients, it's a medical support. So we need to remember maybe it comes also back to this whole coaching question. It's like when there's no mandate for coaching, we don't do coaching. When there's no mandate for opening the chakras, or whatever that means, well, there's no opening of the chakras in the medical houses. So they had to align on this. And then the second day was about the redesign of the organization, because one of the members who had been there for a while would be leaving, and they had to also redesign the way that they would organize and also get funding or money, because most of them were doing this in a voluntary basis. So it was kind of a tough topic. But again, as I said, I'm not at all an expert in yoga and in non-profit organization. So the only thing I can do is hold a space, figure out what the next activity we can do based on what happened just before.
Yeah, and that's just a mindset and approach, and you have to improvise. And you mentioned role play before. Sometimes the word role play can be scary, so you need to find, even though it's very powerful, but it's not, doesn't mean that you always have to do it, but maybe find another terminology around it, because you have some other. I remember when we spoke just before setting up this episode, you were a magician for a few minutes. Now, this is an audio and video podcast, so maybe you can share some of the activities. I want to ask you about what surprises people the most. And maybe it's one activity, but also obviously the outcomes and so on.
The activity that they need. So there's a couple of ones that are kind of important, but maybe, because this is an audio and video thing, I'm going to maybe take one that people can also do while listening to this podcast. Of course, if you're biking or driving, it might be a bit difficult, but the activity is,
you want to do it now. Okay.
If you have a pen, you can take a pen and then you put it at arm's length in front of you. Okay. And then you need to watch the pen closely, really look at the pen, focus at the pen. Okay, so Maria, what do you see?
Well, to be honest, I'm focusing on the audio and the recording. But
All right. But if you were focusing on the pen, you would probably see the pen. I mean, I'm focusing on the pen and I mainly see the pen. And I have trouble seeing the rest. The rest is a bit like fuzzy and I can't blurry. Yeah. Now, if I still hold the pen at arm's length and I look at all the rest, if I look at my screen, if I look at the room in front of me and so on, I will see the room, but I will not see the pen focused. I will actually see two pens. And so this is also an activity where you can actually see that depending what you focus on, the rest of the world will be blurry. So you cannot focus and on the short term, maybe the pen, and the long term at the same time. But you need to be able to switch from one to the other in order to have a good understanding of what needs to happen.
Yeah.
So
That's one to do at home if you're listening or watching. So how do you maintain this safe space?
So my first answer is I don't know. My second answer is I make everyone responsible for it. If I'm the only one who's kind of holding the safe space, it becomes dangerous if I need to go to the toilet at some point. I mean, you know, so I'd rather make sure that everyone also knows that it's everyone's space. And again, this is the invisible facilitator. As I try as much as possible to put everyone's responsibility up there. And it's with some activities, basically some conversational activities and some tactics that make it so that people feel safe to share their ideas without being judged. And this is the most important ones. This is why usually I start with that, so that people after 5 to 10 minutes, they realize, okay, they can share stuff freely because it will probably never be traced back to them.
Yeah, that's essential. And I think I want to jump into this a bit. You do visual facilitation.
Yes.
For some reason, I thought that that was what you did primarily, but obviously not. But it's just part of, your toolkit. And this is a great way of making people feel safe, even though people freak out when you tell them, you're going to draw something, and then you start with a circle and a square, and then they're calmer. So what got you into that? And when do you do visual facilitation?
So what got me into that was when I was a Scrum Master, I was facilitating some Scrum events like retrospectives. I was also teaching some of my colleagues about Scrum because it was still in the early days. I mean, maybe not early days of Scrum, but it was in the early days where people were still looking at that like, okay, what is this thing? I've heard of that, but I'm not quite sure. So I was teaching some sessions on Scrum or on Agile, depending. And then someone told me, hey, like when you do that, you can maybe draw some posters. And I thought, but I can't draw. So somebody talked to me about Bicablo. So I went for a training with Bicablo in Germany. Good that I can speak German. And initially I went there in order to be able to draw some posters as a support of my training sessions. But actually, when I came back, I saw something even more powerful because I had created one poster that kind of described the Scrum process and the different events around that. In the next trainings I gave, I started to see a shift in focus and attention because I still had my slides with me and I would still, go over the theory and stuff like that. But I realized when people had questions, instead of trying to get back to the previous slide, I would go to the poster, and then by going to the poster and checking whether I had answered the question, so maybe some other questions would arise, or there would be. So basically, we started to have some conversations about a topic, instead of me just regurgitating some theory in front of a group that falls asleep. I really noticed a shift in focus and a shift in energy in the room just by having this drawing and using it as part of the training. But of course, there's so much that is not said. The drawing, of course, describes the process, but the key thing is also to know how much or how little to put on the poster, because otherwise it's as overwhelming as it's as famous as a slide with font size 3 with lots of information in it, So having a poster with the minimum information so that we can have a conversation around is key to that.
And you obviously still do that, right?
Yes. Yeah. So when I'm teaching stuff, I use some visual aids, some visual support for my work. I don't draw everything out visually. Often in workshops or in training sessions, when we need to summarize the main ideas, well, since now I can also write legibly, I capture all the information on a poster that they can then take back, and usually they do that. So people take back the poster. It's a nice reminder of what happened in the room.
And it's a great selling point also, because that always remember you are to stay at the line. Critical. You mentioned energy. in the room and energy levels. I want to share this with that's a vulnerable moment. It's not only about the people or participants in the room, but if you're co-facilitating. And that one I discovered because I facilitated a session with someone I'd never facilitated with before. So we assumed that it would go perfectly, but it didn't, just because the levels of energy we put in were not the same. So I tend to go high and low, whereas my colleague would stay on a high as I felt it. Okay. So the dynamics were different, and it's no one's fault. It's just that we were not in sync at all. So I just want to, I think, maybe you have something about you and the audience, I mean, participants, not audience. Yeah. And you co-facilitating, how do you manage the energy levels?
Super interesting question. Maybe one of my great example of co-facilitation was last year. I co-facilitated with Ornella Vasilevskaite a session at Agile 2023 in Edinburgh. And we had never worked together, never even facilitated together. We only like some friends. And so we, thanks to the lockdown and COVID, we stayed in touch because she's based in Lithuania, I'm based in Belgium. At some point, we realized that there was an opportunity to run workshops or to submit for Agile 2023. And we decided to run a workshop. But yeah, we both have different ways of handling it. And the way that we prepared for it, beyond going through the topic that we wanted to introduce, was like, how are we going to work together? How are we going to support each other when one is low on energy or one is higher on energy? And this is really, I would say, the crucial part, because from my experience, when people have some experience in facilitation, it's more about like, how do we dance together than what are we going to design as a step-by-step plan? Because it's also about knowing when to let go and let the other, hey, I've got this idea, I'm going to do this. We don't need to align on that. It's because if first we need to discuss, are we going to do that, yes or no? Well, for the participants, it sounds like a bit maybe, sometimes we have that, or sometimes we are not sure because the group brings something forward and we are not sure for what and then I think it's always best to put it out there, to say like, hey, we didn't plan for this, so let's figure out what to do. Maybe give a small break or something. People always like some breaks when they have worked a lot. But I think this is really the key part, is in finding the right way to work together, whatever everyone's level of energy. And also with the audience, because you talked about the audience. And of course, it always sounds nice and easy when I talk about facilitation. And it's not always the case. Sometimes people just don't want to be there, but are forced to be there. And to me, this is where people can really make a difference as facilitators, is they can acknowledge, hey, folks, you don't want to be there. We're here for this. So let's try and do as much or as little as we want/can, or as is possible. Because if people in the room are sworn enemies, but they had been put together because they're the right people on the Excel sheet, well, we're not gonna, it's not like in 1 hour we can achieve miracles. The first, you talked about safe space. The first thing we'll need to put into this room is trust the others, even though we're sworn enemies. And it's not about being best friends.
No.
I don't care whether people are best friends after the workshop or not. I care that they do the work they need to do.
Yeah, exactly. And sometimes it can come down to little things, but there's just this, I would use the word hate just to exaggerate that there's a blockage and they just don't want to work together. Yeah. And they don't realize that it's just communication. We have a common goal. We have different roles. Let's just do it.
And that is the hardest part as a facilitator, because sometimes you can try all the tricks in the book and you can say, oh, I did this and it fails. But that usually means that it's really the moment where, as facilitators, it's to be even more curious. Oh, what's happening? I'm curious. Oh, this has never worked that way. I've never had that kind of reaction. What could be the case? And really, the super important thing is to suspend judgment. It's easy to fall back into judgment when I say, oh, come on, they're just stupid, or it's the culture, or it's whatever, like just blame it on whatever. But it's really important to suspend judgment and to find even the tiniest thing that they could do together and to focus on that.
And this is where activities help. that are not, and play, basically. This is key. We might be talking about really abstract things here and not tangible, but this is really, things happen because people work together. I mean, who don't work together. So work together greatly or work together not in a very good way. And this is perceived on the outside, on what you deliver and the experience people get. So I have a weird question here, I would say, because this is very, I wouldn't even say abstract because it's not completely, but it's not about numbers, right? So how can you measure the impact of your work?
My friend Samantha Glibert wrote a post a couple of months ago about exactly that same thing on LinkedIn. And it was like, sometimes you go about and you have a workshop to do something and to have a specific outcome, and we don't have that outcome. But what you may notice is that suddenly people go more often together for lunch, or that they are more ready to help each other. So this is also a way that we can measure impact. We see that they're talking more than what they did before. We're seeing maybe more group dynamics. We see that now they reach out to the people from the other team because they know that they can help them instead of sending them emails, So these are parts of the answers. I thought that her way of framing that was really beautiful. And I think measuring impact is not did we reach the goal, is how different is the group today than it was yesterday.
Yeah, because it's little wins. It's not going to be little steps, because that's how you build a castle, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's stone after stone after stone after stone after stone. And bit by bit, the foundations, for me, the most important part to work on is ensure that there's trust in the group. Okay, we can work together. It's not about friendship. It's really about, okay, we can do this together, or we can at least go in that direction together. Maybe a useful metaphor for facilitation and for meeting objectives or even workshop objectives. If a group decides to go to the Mont Blanc, okay, we can get all our materials, we can start. But it's only when we are on the road that we will realize what our group is really made of. Will we really be able to get to the top of the Mont Blanc? Will we at some point decide that going halfway is good enough for our group? Maybe there will be storms and we will have to come back because it's not safe out there. So it's all about all these decisions that can only be made while we start working together, but not before.
Yeah, there's no amount of work you're going to do that will guarantee that is going to work out. But it's, again, just experience and mindset. And one question, what's your relationship with your gut, actually, at work while doing what you're doing, but also in your life in general?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. How deep do I want to go? Do I have the guts to say what I think, even though maybe the rest of the group might not see? I had that a couple of weeks ago. I'm teaching a facilitation class, and some people told me that they have been very, very busy, and so they had no time to practice, and they wanted some more theory and said that I was not providing enough theory. And then one other person said, actually at the beginning, I also found out that there was a thought that there was not enough theory, but I wanted to try something with my group. And so I went back into our chat logs and I found out all the references that Charlie has shared. And actually throughout the references, I could find back what we had done. And so we could work on that with my team, and it had great results. So just the fact of speaking up and giving an opinion that may not be the same as one's colleague is, for me, really something that shows that it's about the guts, and it's about really deciding to say it instead of staying silent. And that's a huge change.
So when we chatted, now that we spoke a bit about that, you told me about a bit the backstory. Maybe you can briefly go into that. So you initially went on a journey to study something else, and you ended up doing something else, and then this something else took you to something else, right?
Yeah, that's a lot of something else's. So I'm going to fill in the blanks. And it's true, when I was 15 or 16, I told my parents I wanted to study psychology. And then they told me, but you're good with computers and you're good with maths and you're good with stuff like that. So why don't you do some civil engineering stuff at the university. You can do any job you want afterwards. And then I trusted them and I believed them. And it's like parents always want what's best for their kids, right? Whatever that means, of course. But I didn't find my place at the university. Maybe I loved partying more than studying. I don't know. Case in point, after some point, I started to do some really technical studies so that I could get my IT degree and then I could start working. And so this is where I entered, as I said earlier on, in the world of systems administrations. It's then bit by bit, also like I told earlier, through my interactions with human beings that I realized that it's actually about the way that people work together. This is where we are solving problems. Writing software code is easy once you've had that conversation about what problem do I want to solve. You need to know how software works. Like it's not easy. That's not what I mean. But once we have figured out what it is that we want and what problem we want to solve, writing the software part is, I would say, the easier. And so this is really what got me into working with human beings. And then sometimes my wife says, you maybe not have studied psychology, but you're getting back to something about working with human beings again. And that's...
Yeah, that's why I asked you the question. Came back 360.
Yeah.
So, is there anything you've never shared before that you could share that could enrich?
Anything I've never shared. Now I need to remember what I've shared in different... I was on. I'm not sure there is something I've never ever shared. Maybe one thing that I want to add, because yes, we've talked about some of the products. We've talked also mainly about things in corporation and industries. But maybe one of the most meaningful programs I worked on was 2 years ago, where last year I worked on a facilitation learning track with a group of folks from Indonesia and a group of folks from the Philippines. And they were non-governmental organizations who are working with young people. One is really about the whole gender spectrum and the place of women in society, and also especially the place of women in society. And the other one was an organization in the Philippines that started as a support group for survivors of gender-based violence. And so both these groups wanted to learn stuff around facilitation and working with groups online also, because there was still some medium lockdown in some of these countries. So it was like about how do we work with groups, whether online or in person. What I noticed there is that ultimately I am not an expert on gender topics. I don't even know what it is like to be a woman. So I don't know what it is like to be a woman in society, and even less in East and Southeast Asia.
You could try now. Everything's possible.
I could try. Still, I'm not sure I would experience what it is like to have menstruation.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that the advances in technology or whatever are like that. So these are things that I will never know. But working with these groups taught me that actually, especially when we have difficult topics, finding ways to get people together and to talk is the first step to figure out a new possibility, something that has never happened before. And this is really what I learned there. And also that as a facilitator, and we talked about that earlier on, I don't have to be an expert to facilitate something. I just need to be good at getting people together and adapting on the spot. I still remember with the Filipino group, they were all women, and it was like, it's a feminist group called Lunat Collective. And I told them, hey, you might not have realized I'm a white middle-aged man, and like I have totally, I don't know what your world is like, and I want to make sure, I was worried that I would start mansplaining stuff, and I really, so I told them, hey, I don't know anything about your world, and they were really kind. They said something, yeah, we didn't hire you, or we didn't want to work with you so that you could tell us everything, but more so that we could learn together, and we want to learn more about how to work with groups and how to work in group dynamics and facilitation, and this is why you're here. And I said, okay, great. So can we work in this partnership where if I do something like which is not useful or something that you don't see useful, you tell me, and so that I can adapt. And so that was really wonderful partnership.
And that's why they want you over there.
Yep. Yeah. It would be my pleasure if I could go back not to go back. If I could go to the Philippines and Indonesia to meet with folks from Lunas Collective and from Pamphlet Generasi in Indonesia. That would really be a dream for me.
Nice. Is there anything you would like to add, or maybe a piece of advice?
So maybe one thing that I would say, for those who listen and would like to try out facilitation, I would advise you to find somebody who can get your back. Find someone who can support you, because facilitation if you're doing it on your own, you may sometimes feel like you're on a lone journey. It's really important to have a couple of, maybe just one, but to have a couple of people who can have your back. And when things are tough, because things will be tough, but that they can also support you with that. Not with offering solutions, but really be there to listen to the things that you're experiencing.
Yeah, and on top of that, like, everyone makes mistakes, so it's just part of the journey. So
yeah,
thank you so much for this. And if someone wants to get in touch, I know you're on LinkedIn.
Yep, I would say this is the primary way to contact me. I do sometimes share pictures on Instagram, but it's very rare. So the best way to contact me is on LinkedIn.
Cool. Thank you so much for this.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much for listening, and see you next time.